Hello, and welcome to the Social Media Mindfulness Q&A. In this conversation, contributors from the Power of Social Media and Effects on Children Teach Out will discuss thoughtful approaches to social media. My name is Hannah Simon, and I'm a Design Management Fellow at the Center for Academic Innovation at the University of Michigan. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. This Teach Out is still live on Coursera and FutureLearn, so please jump in and engage with our community of global learners. You can find the link to the Teach Out in the chat now. I want to thank everyone who has submitted questions in the Teach Out and in the event registration. During this live session today, we invite you to submit additional questions for our panelists in the YouTube chat section, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Given our limited time, we ask that you keep your questions related to the topic. As we bring together this diverse community in discussion, we also ask that you be respectful of our speakers and other learners as you engage with the event and with the Teach Out. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be emailed out to attendees afterward. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists today. Ethan Kross is a professor of psychology and management organizations at the University of Michigan. Ethan is a psychologist, neuroscientist, and writer who specializes in emotion regulation. His research examines how people can control their emotions to improve their understanding of how self-control works and to discover ways of enhancing self-control in daily life. Next, we have Scott W. Campbell, Constance F. and Arnold C. Pohs Professor of Telecommunications at the University of Michigan. Scott's research examines how mobile communication patterns are linked to both the private and public spheres of social life, such as social networking and civic engagement, and situates the role of mobile communication technology in the larger media landscape and across different societies. We also have Ella Cavalier with us. She is an undergraduate at the University of Michigan. Ella has over 500,000 followers on TikTok and 60,000 on Instagram. She brings her reflections on influencing culture to the Teach Out. All right, let's jump right in. So the first question is for Ethan. Ethan, how does your research relate to social media mindfulness?
Well, first, thanks for having me here. It's great to be in this wonderful company. So for a long time, what we've been doing in my lab is trying to understand how using social media impacts people's well-being, how they feel, how satisfied they are with their lives. And we've learned that there are different ways of interacting with social media that can push people's emotions in different directions. And so when I think about social media mindfulness, what comes to mind is being aware of how engaging with social media in different ways pushes you up or down in terms of how good or bad you feel, or doesn't have any effect at all. And I think it's a critically important thing for social media users to try to cultivate. In the same way that we learn how to navigate offline neighborhoods to our betterment. We know you shouldn't go to this neighborhood at this time, and you could go here, or you shouldn't talk to this person this way. You should, talk to people politely and so forth. There are different ways of interacting with that offline space that can influence us positively or negatively. I think the same is true of social media. And so that's my take on social media mindfulness.
Yeah, great. And Scott, what is your connection to your scholarly activity and social media mindfulness?
Sure. So as a communication scholar, I'm interested in the way our landscape of media is evolving over time. And I'm interested in the opportunities and the challenges that come along with this. It's, to me, the media is kind of the fabric of how everyday life plays out. It's the fabric upon which we play out our everyday lives. And we see, just looking at some of the problems today, problems of democracy. We can see this where people maybe are not having access to information in certain parts of the world. We see problems of misinformation in parts of the world where people are responding to information and news in ways that are very harmful. And we see, I'm writing about issues of solitude and just finding spaces where we can be alone and reflect and center ourselves. And so I think that a lot of these problems right now are being addressed, or at least the call is for media literacy. And my take on this right now is that we need to establish a sense of mindfulness as kind of a prerequisite, I think. So I think literacy is helpful. I consider literacy to be a collection of forms, skills and training and resources, fact-checking, things and forms. But I think of mindfulness as kind of a mode that we can get into, a media mindfulness mode. And And as with mindfulness, we wouldn't necessarily critically evaluate anything in this mode yet. It would just be a sense of awareness of what's at stake and what's going on around us. I can talk more about this, but my take on it is to come at it as a two-part framework, and that media literacy cannot stand by itself, that we need to do more.
Awesome, great. And Ella, you are here with us today because of your experience as a social media influencer. As you transitioned from being a user of social media to an influencer, how was your relationship with social media changed?
I think for me, when I first joined social media, I didn't really set out to be an influencer. Social media kind of grew popularity when I was like in elementary school. So it has kind of been part of my life as I've been growing up. And I never really set out to be the influencers that I saw as I was growing up. It kind of just happened in a way that I was a little bit unprepared for, and I was kind of unprepared for the way that it would change me as someone who uses the platform versus someone who other people kind of look up to. Growing up, I looked up to a lot of social media influencers, and being that kind of person, knowing that there are people out there who are viewing my content and who are going to be influenced by the choices that I make online, it kind of has made me more aware of what I'm doing online and how I can be perceived by others. A big part about being on such a public stage is self-esteem, and that was something that I really struggled with as I was transitioning from a user to an influencer. Just being worried about being judged. Being a public figure is really difficult in the sense that you can feel like your worth is kind of translated into how many views and how many likes you get, and that is something that I kind of touched on in the teach out. So that's definitely something that I wasn't expecting as I switched over from being a user, because when you're kind of just in the background, you are enjoying content, but you're not really being judged in the way that you are as an influencer. And that's definitely something that has changed the way that I view social media. Instead of it being something that kind of is just part of my life, it's definitely something that's taken more of a central role in not only my presence online, but kind of just how I view myself. And it definitely has taught me a lot as I've grown up. But yeah, so I think the major thing that changed was just the way that I allow myself to be perceived online and my kind of public awareness in online spaces.
Can I jump in with a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you find that you have two different identities or more online, in the sense that there's your role as an influencer, and there's specific things that you have in mind when you're engaging in those activities, what are other people going to think, so forth and so on, but then presumably you're also navigating social media in this kind of covert mode where you're not doing influencing, you're just doing the kinds of things that someone your age might do. And is the emotional experience different when you go from one role to the other?
Yeah, definitely. So when I'm more on an influencing stage, I kind of have to be more conscious of how what I'm saying can affect other people. Not saying that if I was just a user, I wouldn't also be conscious of the things that I'm putting online, because as we all know, your online footprint is forever pretty much. But when I also have private accounts that I share with just my friends, and definitely when I'm on those more private accounts where it's not strangers that I'm interacting with, I feel like I can almost be more myself versus the persona that I put on my main channels. Not saying that my main channels aren't me, but they're definitely more catered towards my audience, whereas on my more private channels, it's more catered towards me as a person. So there's definitely two very different sides to the things that you see that influencers want you to see versus kind of the more backstage parts of their lives that maybe aren't as glamorous, but it's still part of who they are, and that's maybe something that's a little bit more hidden, at least in my personal experience.
Yeah, I love that, and I actually think that, whether you're aware of it or not, you're taking a page from some of the research in terms of how to take what we know about who people are and use that information to navigate social media profitably. Like when you say both are still you, that's entirely true, because we all have these different features of ourselves. There's Ethan as, dad, there's Ethan as professor, there's Ethan as incompetent handyman in the house, like different parts of me. And they're very, very different, but they're all me. And so just as there's the influencer you and whatever you would call the second, social media user, those can still, I think, feel authentic, but be linked with very different behaviors online, and maybe even emotional reactions. So super interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So we're talking about mindfulness today. How would you all define mindfulness, and can you share some examples of mindfulness as you see it?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. There are lots of different definitions of mindfulness. I'd love to hear, Scott, what you think of this as someone who's thought about mindfulness as it relates specifically to this space. The definition that I'm familiar with really pertains to mindfulness with respect to our own internal thought processes and feeling states. And the idea is when you're being mindful, you're being aware of what is happening in a very non-judgmental, accepting way. And there are other features to that. Sometimes we're adopting this kind of detached perspective when we're being mindful, where we're recognizing that things happening in the mind aren't necessarily a direct readout on who we are as individuals, but sometimes they're just things that happen in the mind, like when you walk down the street and a thought pops into your head that maybe you're ashamed of, or it makes you feel a particular way, it doesn't speak well of you. That doesn't mean that you're a crappy person. It's just something that occurred and will pass. And so mindfulness involves just being more aware of those internal computations that are happening at any given moment in time. But you've thought about this specifically
I have.
as it relates to social media. So one thing that I'd be very curious about is, have you had to adapt this concept of mindfulness when you apply it to social media, or have you found that there's a direct translation from the mental health space where this term has been disseminated?
I'm glad you asked, because I am working through this a little bit, and I'm reading up on definitions of mindfulness, and for the most part, I'm working from the same place that you are. A couple of key components of mindfulness, or a few key components. One of them is the non-reactivity, so that you're having experiences. My outlook on mindfulness, I think, is pretty much the same as Ethan's, other than the fact that his is a little more internal on what's going on inside of here, and your mindfulness is focused there. And my mindfulness is more, I think, emphasizes the social context around us and the experiences that we're having and with other people. And so I think that, to me, non-reactivity is important. Awareness, a level of awareness. And what I'm struggling with is this, and maybe you can help me. But I'll
do my best.
Okay, this is what I read about mindfulness, and I'm thinking about how I can address this. Getting lost in the moment is one of the ways that people talk about mindfulness that I'm not sure completely aligns with what I'm thinking about. So what I'm thinking about is where we have a sense of, let's just say, for example, that you're in a group chat. It's on WeChat, and this is one of the common venues where misinformation is spreading, right? And it's, let's say, about the election in Brazil, or it could be about religion in Indonesia, or about health in India, or it doesn't matter. Somebody is doing something to try to stir up problems, right, of misinformation. And I think that a sense of just an awareness that misinformation is a problem, and that this is what's going on, that this is the landscape upon which a lot of people are hopping on for the first time to express themselves and to feel a part of things. There's a lot going on with WeChat. There's a lot more going on with these groups than just the text, and the bubbles. And thinking about this as a venue for activating people, a venue that can ignite protests, a venue that can ignite lynchings, which we've seen, a venue where information is spreading, and so I guess what I'm thinking is, a sensitivity and an awareness that's almost like an instinct, like if you're driving, you see something out of the corner of your eye and you're like, okay, you have an instinct, you got to kind of keep an eye on that because it's safe, it's a safety thing. And what I mean by media mindfulness is having an instinctual sense of your environment, how digitized everything is, and how information, may or may not, what's it really at stake. And I don't think people are entering the social media environment, I guess, with this kind of zero order understanding of what's at stake and what's going on. I think that people are kind of reacting, and diving straight in and getting excited and getting offended and, that kind of thing. And so I guess I'm having a hard time with like losing yourself in the moment as it relates to just being aware of how much of life is a hybrid reality between our analog and our digital,
Yeah. Well, do either of you want to jump in? I could jump in too. Anyway.
It's all you.
All me, okay. So, you raise a number of very important issues. And I think one general issue has, dealing with this being in the moment. Like, I'm sure you've heard about this plenty. It pops up all the time on social media and is very popular in our culture. And I think it is important just to keep in mind that, like, human beings are not designed to always be in the moment. And it's actually an incredible feat of evolution that we can transport ourselves in time, in our minds. We could learn from the past, think about the future. And I would argue that engaging in that mental time travel when we are logging into WeChat or whatever your platform before we figure out how to respond could be a really good thing, right? Like, well, this person is saying something really awful. What might be going on? That's taking me out of the moment, right? That's broadening my perspective when I hear you talk in a way that is very different from just having this direct processing of what's happening without making any kinds of judgment. So I think being in the moment is not necessarily all you'd want to do on social media if you want to optimize its implications for well-being. And I actually think just being very reactive on social media can sometimes be harmful, like when a negative thought or feeling pops into our head and our bodies, and we're really motivated to share it with other people, and we just get on and start doing that. I think you get lots of bad things happening. When I think of mindfulness as it relates to social media more generally, I think we'd be better off looking a little bit deeper about what specifically we want people to do. Because as you mentioned, mindfulness has these different pieces. So what are the active ingredients that we think are really important for optimizing a person's actual experience? Is it the non-reactivity piece? Is it the looking at the bigger picture and broader context piece? Is it, I don't know, fill in your favorite other piece there. But I think once we move past mindfulness, which has a lot of baggage, it becomes much easier for people to act in a very practical way. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm thinking, again, going back to something I said earlier, simply getting into a mode,
Yeah.
So like when we go to the office, to go to work, you're
Do we do that anymore?
When we used to do that,
Yeah.
you're in a mode, right? You put
Yeah.
on your work shoes and you're in a mode, right? I really like how Ella said the word backstage when she was talking about her social media experiences, and there is theory in actually sociology, we use it in comm all the time. Irving Goffman, front stage, backstage, and how we play out on different stages.
Life's a performance.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that so I think that there's a mode where, if I can say, a mode where it's probably hard work at first to get into this mode, but where you do something that I'll take out of your book, your book Chatter, is you advise people to take a little bit of distance, do some distancing. And I think that that what I'm suggesting is people find a way to do that automatically. So the distancing that you talk about in your book is to
Right.
and maybe it's a temporal distance where you take a moment or a pause, or maybe it's a linguistic, as I recall, like refer to yourself in the third person, right? That kind of thing.
You got it. You paid attention.
Yeah, distance is you. And so I guess like what I'm arguing is to take your advice.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, I can't
in a
dispute
social
that.
media context is to take your advice, but to make it in a way so that it comes natural to you, right? That's the mode I'm talking about.
Yeah.
A habit.
Yeah. So then I guess how I would interpret that is what you're pushing towards is this idea that we should be less reactive, like just as default. If we see something that bugs us, we just respond or make certain kinds of character attributions. Try to build in some space that prevents us from responding on those impulses, and make that distanced, more controlled response the automatic default.
Depending on the context.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
You don't have to say any. Well, maybe we should say more for people who are listening, but the context here being, depending on what our goals are, we may have different orientations.
If you're in and I want to stop and give Ella a chance to contribute here, but I would suggest like if you're in say a small chat, maybe an interpersonal situation, an IM or texting, it might be appropriate to get super mindless, right? And lose yourself in that interaction, immerse, and that's okay. But that's a different audience, and you have to be sensitive to the stage, that you're on.
So I have a question for you, Ella. Okay. So when you're in either role, either as an influencer or what should we call the other role? Just a regular old user?
Yeah.
A mere mortal like the rest of us.
Sure.
So when you're in either role, when you find yourself just logging in and scrolling in any platform, are you ever concerned about what might pop up and how that would make you feel? Or, are your emotions ever something that you have in mind when you're engaging with these platforms, or are they just not really relevant?
I feel like that might be a little bit difficult because I'm trying to and formulate my thoughts.
Yeah, well,
here.
Let me tell you where this question is coming from. So, I've spoken to a lot of people over the years about their experiences on social media and how it impacts their emotions. And there are definitely positive ways of interacting with the technology, negative ways too. But what a lot of people often describe is there's this uncertainty. They log in and, they're having fun, good, cool. Oh my God! And they don't know when that little landmine that elicits negativity is going to go off, and that's unsettling. And it's true on Twitter, on Instagram, and on other platforms too. And so I'm just curious if that experience that people have anecdotally relayed to me, does that speak to your experience on there at all? And if so, what do you do about it? Because you're presumably spending a reasonable amount of time on there.
Yeah. So for me, I think it's less of an actual like shock. I think something that comes with growing up with social media and constantly being surrounded by stuff that can be shocking or disturbing, it kind of almost desensitizes you in a way. And I think that at the end of the day, I'm not consciously aware of the stuff that I could find shocking or disturbing in the moment, but by the end of my time on social media, I'm like, wow, that can have a more of a subconscious effect on the way that I feel that day. But I don't think it's something that I could pick out and be like, that really shocked me to my core, and that's going to be something that I think about. I think it would be more of a subconscious, I'm laying in bed at night and I'm like, wow, I saw that today. Yeah. That was kind of crazy. That definitely had an effect on my emotions, but I'm just not consciously aware of it at the time of it happening.
Well, it's so interesting you say that, because in one of the first studies we ever did on how using social media impacts the way people feel, what we found is that if people just logged in and took in what was happening in their feeds, that didn't impact how they felt in the moment. But we then asked them at the end of the day how it made them feel. And it turns out, relative to another group that was told to use social media in a more active way where they talked to other people, the people who were just taking stuff in, at the end of the day, they experienced a decline in how they felt. So it's consistent with what you're saying, where it may not be immediate, but it's after it happens and we think about it and maybe reflect, oh God, I said that and they didn't respond, or whatever, I don't know. You tell me what the uncomfortable bits on social media are. That's when it has its impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a little bit different though. I was just thinking about, I sometimes will be scrolling through like TikTok and I'll laugh out loud at something that I think is funny, and that definitely I have an immediate response to. I don't know if there's a certain name for it, but then the more sad stuff that I can see, maybe someone's dog passed away, and that I have less of an immediate emotional reaction to. But again, that would be something that could have a toll on me at the end of the day or the end of that week. All of it kind of builds up, whereas something that made me happy, where I'm laughing like out loud and my roommates think I'm crazy because they can hear me laughing in my room, that is more immediate, but then I don't really think about that the next day. Whereas something sad, I would think about for way longer and kind of hold on to that subconsciously longer. Mm-hmm. I don't know if there's a specific phenomena that could fall under, but that's just something that I've observed in my own using of social media.
I mean, there definitely are. And, one of my favorite findings in psychology is this idea that bad is stronger than good. And the idea is that the negative stuff has more weight. It affects us more strongly than the positive stuff. And, we don't know exactly why that is. One idea is because negative things are more of a threat to our survival and well-being than positive experiences. But the take-home is it takes many more positive experiences to counteract a negative. So there is some science to support your experience.
This is true with news too, by the way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's why I think we have those clickbait headlines sometimes.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And going off of life being a performance, we often only see the positive sides of social media, or the positive sides of people's lives in social media. How do users combat this feeling of less than? Do you have any strategies? I know you talked about distancing. Are there any other strategies that you can think of? And this is for anyone.
I'd love to hear, Ella, how
maybe
you
get a practical perspective.
Yeah,
on this
it's you're on the ground in a way that we aren't, and so when you come across let's say you're in Ella as influencer mode, and you come across with someone who has more followers than you, who's just killing it, and you're competitive with, does that ever make you feel sad or bad and momentarily? And if so, what do you do about it?
So I think definitely when I first started gaining a following, it was really easy to compare myself to other people, especially because I gained my following when I was still in high school. I was still 17, trying to figure out my life, and it was really very easy to be like, wow, these people look like they're having so much fun in their lives, and I don't know what I'm doing yet. And it definitely does kind of take a toll on you and how you feel about yourself if you see, oh, me and this other person are doing the same thing, but they're getting way more likes and followers. It's really hard to separate between you as a person and the you that you're presenting online, because at the end of the day, you have to think these people don't know me. They don't know who I am, really. They just see what I want them to see, and they shouldn't be allowed to make me feel bad about myself or make me feel less than. And that's kind of something that I've learned over the past few years of being on that public stage, is you have to separate the you that is online and the real you. So I kind of relate it to how you can really like or hate a movie character, but the actor is a completely different person. So you could despise a character played by the actor, but you can love the actor. So I kind of think it as my persona online and my persona in real life don't necessarily have to be tied together. So if there's a video that I do that doesn't do well, it doesn't mean that I'm not a good person, that I don't have a whole life outside of my online persona, and kind of separating between the two, and again, distancing myself, taking a step back and realizing that online is not real life kind of helps me personally realize that no, your worth isn't tied to how many likes you get, how many shares, how many followers, because at the end of the day, that's not necessarily the only you that there is.
Mm-hmm. That sounds pretty healthy. It makes me think of a couple of things. Number one, you're engaging in these different ways of making sense of your online and offline behaviors that help get you through the day, so to speak. That may be a little dramatic, but allow you to continue hosting these different identities online. What implication does that then have for people on the other side who are tuning in? I think that's a really interesting question. But I think this tendency to step back, look at the bigger picture, make these distinctions, I think those are useful ways of grappling with this issue. I know that personally, when I've come across this person who I usually like, but great things are happening and I'm a human and I feel bad as a result, sometimes that happens. One thing I'll do is I'll remind myself that I'm not going to be upset about this tomorrow or a week later. It's something called mental time travel or temporal distancing. It's a really useful tool, right? Because one of the things we know about most emotional reactions is they peak, but then they eventually subside. And when you're in the midst of experiencing a negative emotion, we can often lose sight of that. So just reminding yourself in the moment, hey, how are you going to feel about this a week from now? That often can take the edge off. The other thing that I've heard people do, and I'm also curious to hear your, or really anyone's take on this, is we can change the way we think about what we're going through in ways that turn the volume on our emotions down, our negative emotions. And I think people who are listening should certainly avail themselves of these tools because they can make a difference. But then there are ways of engaging with the technology that can also help us in a complementary way. That may sound complicated, but it's really simple. Like if someone is making you feel bad, you just unfollow or silence them. You curate your social media feeds to optimize the impact that it has on you. And I'm curious if you ever do that. So you work at both of these levels, both changing the information you're exposed to, as well as how you think about what's happening to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's really cool about a lot of social media apps is you can mute things that you don't want to see, or you can filter out keywords, stuff like that. And for me, I try to make my relationship with social media as healthy as possible by most of my Instagram explore page is very positive. They're graphics and they're, oh, you did great today. Stuff like that to make social media more appealing almost. And same with who I am following. I, of course, follow my friends because I love to see what they're doing in their lives, but I also follow other influencers who I'm like, I really appreciate what they're doing. And this is making my social media a happier place for me because I can see people who I love and who I care about, but also things that I aspire to be, not in a jealous standpoint, but in a this could be my future if I worked hard at it. And it's a really fine line between I'm jealous of this person and this is the life that I want versus I aspire to be this person and I'm going to make the conscious decisions to make actions that will help me become more like them. And again, it's a really fine line and it's really hard to distinguish the point between is this person, is it healthy for me to follow them and want to be like them, or is this coming out of place of jealousy and where this is no longer healthy and I should just unfollow? But again, what's nice is you have to remember that if something isn't pleasing you, you can just unfollow, you can mute it, you can say, I don't want to see this stuff anymore. And that's also what I think is cool about social media is that as much as there is negative stuff out there, you can also find ways to make it more curated to what you want to see and make it positive for you.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to think about your question, Hannah, in the context of parents of kids who are on social media. So how do you deal with all the bad stuff about social media when you have kids and you don't know much about what what's going on, right? This is something that I encounter a lot and I hear a lot about. And my suggestion is a couple of things. One of them is, well, first of all, I think parents should talk to their kids about their social media activity kind of on the same level that they talk to their kids about their friends. Traditionally speaking, do you, as a parent, do you know who your kid is running around with? Do you know who their friends are? Do you know whose houses they go over to and sleep over at, and that kind of stuff? And I think that you don't necessarily need to know, who they're friends with exactly on social media, but I think it's good to know what social media accounts they have and what they use them for. But I also think that's important for parents to do this at different ages and different ways. It's very developmentally nuanced, social media and kids. And so there's not just one youth. The way that 13, 14, 15-year-olds use social media, 13, 14 especially, is very different than 16, 17, 18. And we have to be really sensitive to some of the things that happen that might be perfectly okay, actually, at the older levels that are not okay at the younger levels, and vice versa. And so my advice to parents is, A, don't freak out when they go on social media. It is, like Ethan talks about it as having impacts or influences. This is where Ethan and I are different. He's in psych, I'm in communication. So to me, social media doesn't influence us. It is the landscape. It is where we conduct our business. You know what I mean? It's the space, the social space. And so I think for parents, the message is, don't freak out. This is how kids do it. It's hybrid. They've got half of their lives happening online. Try to stay on top of, generally what they're doing so that you can get a sense if there's problems. And then if you're a parent, you get those smoke, and where there's smoke, there's fire, right? Then you feel it out as a parent. How much do you trust your kid? And I would say try to navigate the social media space the way that you navigate traditional friendship spaces, in terms of feeling out what's the appropriate boundaries for privacy and autonomy, being respectful, but then having a sense of just, is my kid okay and safe?
Yeah, I'll piggyback off this. I mean, it's very consistent with what I tell people too. In the same way that we socialize our children, and I've got two of them who are in this territory now, we socialize them with respect to how to navigate the offline world. I think we ought to be doing the same thing for social media. What's been really tricky, I think, for parents is that because social media is so new, we haven't had these thousands of years of learning to guide us, to get our culture has given us lessons that our parents imparted to us, which we then impart to our children. We don't listen to everything our parents say, but you get the point. And because social media is so new, we just haven't had the time to get those lessons and actually make sure that what our culture is telling us is actually valid, right? I mean, platforms change, algorithms change, and the whole ecosystem changes. And so that makes it really, it poses a challenge for parents, I think. But here's the good news. So I just got back from a meeting where there were these large-scale studies. They're not published yet, so take that as a caveat, but they will be soon, I'm sure. And they looked at what predicts child well-being in the context of social media. And it turns out it was really attentive, empathic parenting. So in other words, the same type of parenting that predicts good outcomes having nothing to do with social media also predicts good outcomes in this social media space. And so, like you're saying, take an interest, learn about their experience, convey to them that you care, and the data from this large study that I just heard about would suggest that kids should be on good footing if we do that.
Yeah, I mean, we're surrounded by flows of bits and bytes constantly in ways that are meaningful. And if you just think, a couple generations ago, it just wasn't like this, right? We're in a different spot as far as human evolution, I guess, is concerned. We're taking it to a different level on our own here.
I mean, just 10 years ago or 15 years ago, which wasn't that long ago, I mean, I was actually embarrassed to tell colleagues that I wanted to study this thing called Facebook. And I mean, the world has changed quite dramatically. I mean, Ella, you in your life, you've probably seen this just metamorphosized over time, since the time you were in elementary school to now. I mean, right?
Well, here's the thing too, is that I was born in 2002. So by the time I can like kind of understand what's going on in the world, there was social media. So I can see how it's changed, but I also don't know what life was like before. Like, it's just always been part of my life, and it has evolved. There's new apps that have come out, and I remember back when Snapchat was a thing, and it had just come out, and me and my friends thought it was stupid at first, because we're like, if you want to send pictures, why don't you just text them to each other? But now Snapchat is this huge multi-million-dollar company, and everybody uses it. Well, at least my age. So seeing how things have changed, it's definitely crazy, but I also have never known any different. So that's also something to consider, is that people, especially kids now, they're never going to know any different. It's just part of your life now, which is a little crazy to think about.
Well, it is crazy to think about. I mean, I think we're living through this just revolutionary period in history, and that can be both scary and also exciting. We've been through these events before, the printing press and other inventions, but we are just at this like period of technological innovation that's just has us really rushing to keep up. But just hearing you talk, I mean, it really just it makes me think about how important it is for us, and when I say us, I mean everyone here who's watching, to be somewhat deliberate about how we engage with these spaces. I'm curious to hear what everyone else thinks about this intuition. The idea being that rather than just download the new app and stumble our ways through it, we take a few seconds or minutes to think about, well, how can we navigate with these different apps to really optimize our experience in this world? And you could optimize it on a number of dimensions, like emotionally, the well-being you derive from interacting with this space, wanting more of the laughters and giggles that your friends make fun of you rather than the sadness. How can you optimize the way you interact this space from a monetary perspective, if that's a goal, right? I mean, social media can bring you money benefits, social capital. Like, there are all these different dimensions that social media is relevant to, and I don't know that people writ large stop to always think about how they can really harness it to help them achieve those kinds of goals. So what does everyone else think about that idea?
Sounds like you're recommending that people have purposes for using social media as opposed to just killing time, which makes a lot of sense, actually. If you think about what's constructive and what's.
And you could even have a social media killing time purpose, so you don't have to give that up entirely, right? This is what I do when I'm just killing time, but rather than just haphazardly stumbling through these different facets of digital life.
I want to hear what Ella has to say to this, but I'll just quickly say that I advocate carving out purposes for social media use so that you have goals and you have things that you can constructively get out of it, but then B, also carving out purposeful time away from it. You know what I mean? Boundaries away from it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard being an influencer and carving time away from it. It's definitely something that I've struggled with, not always basing my life on my life online, cultivating relationships outside of the relationships that you create online. As an influencer, a lot of my friends are also influencers that live in different cities, different states, and I've met through online, but then also relating that back to my real life. It's definitely important to make sure you have those boundaries that, okay, I'm going to spend time with myself and just be myself instead of I have to take a picture every time I do something. And
I have to ask, okay, you said real life, So do you consider this not real life? I mean, to what extent? Will you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Those are some fighting words. You just uttered.
No, I'm just totally fascinated, that's all.
I guess when I say real life, of course, my life online is part of my real life. But I guess real life in the sense that it's away from the screen and it's real feelings and real. Not saying that your online connections can't be real connections, but I think having like a tangible space that's not online for you to have emotions and create relationships is just different. I don't necessarily think that online isn't real life, but I think there's definitely a difference between the stuff that you do offline and the stuff that you do online. But again, it's not that it's not real. I don't know how to say that.
No, that was a great answer. Thank you. Yeah, no, it was good. Thank you.
So over the years, we've done a series of studies where we try to look at how different forms of social interaction impact people emotionally. And so we look at different ways of using social media platforms, and does that lead to a change in how you feel from one moment to the next? And then we also look at interactions with people in the real world. I did that just to offline interactions, right? Face to face. And what has been really interesting is we have consistently found across studies that the biggest positive emotional bang that you get for your buck, to use that phrase, comes from the offline interactions. Consistently engaging with other people in the physical world, that's not, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Off of social media, predicts improvements in how good people feel from one moment to the next. Social media, it's much more varied. Some ways of interacting with it can be good, bad, or benign. But it always struck me as a very interesting finding, right? Because we talk a lot about the social media side, but not necessarily always about how it compares and contrasts to the offline side of things, at least in the psychological world. So I think getting a break, the data would suggest that that could be good, especially if you talk to other people.
Yeah.
I think we're queuing to go back to you.
Yeah, so we have a couple learner questions. One learner asked about the effects of social media addiction on the brain. Ethan, do you have any thoughts? Does this appear to mimic other types of addiction?
So this is a great question, and I recently discovered that one of the reasons why there's so much work on addiction is that it's been heavily funded. There's a lot of money coming to understand what this social media addiction is, and it turns out that we don't exactly know just yet. There's a lot of debate about this. If you ask me what my feeling is, I think there are social media is desirable for a variety of reasons, and so there is some overlap between how you engage with social media and the desire that we have to do so, and our desire to consume other pleasant activities and substances. But when you look at some of the addictive properties of things like drugs or other kinds of things that we're addicted to, I think there are some notable differences. And so there may be subsets of individuals who are particularly vulnerable to getting hooked and staying hooked on social media. I think there's a huge distribution, and so that's my take on addiction, social media addiction.
I think habit is a better framework. I think Ethan's right. There's a small subset of people who could get addicted to anything,
Yes.
Squishy materials, whatever, But when it comes to social media and social media addiction, I think what we're talking about is more like usage patterns that are habits, and habits can be good or bad. And I don't think we need to send a generation of kids to social media rehab and they quit.
That's right.
I think we need to raise up the mindfulness level so that they can be motivated to adjust their habits.
And along those lines, one of the things we know that makes social media so alluring is the fact that it gives us social rewards, right? When we get that like, we are a social species. And so we love to get information about how our collective is thinking about us. So that's really desirable information. You can see it activating reward circuitry in the brain, but that doesn't mean we're addicted to this in the same way that we are cocaine or other drugs.
I agree. Or do you think differently? Are we addicted to it?
I don't think it's like the same addiction. You know, I definitely agree with both of you in that it's not the same as getting addicted to like drugs or something like that, and it's more habitual where it's like a bad habit that you can't kick. So some people will say that smoking, it's a bad habit they can't kick, but some people will say, no, you're addicted. So I think it could definitely be parts of both. And again, repeating what you said, I think it's just important that we kind of increase our mindfulness of usage and are kind of aware of how we're interacting with social media, but how social media is also interacting with our own personal lives and our well-being.
Well said.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, as we are nearing the end of our time, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
I like what Ella just said in the context of what Ethan said about having purposes for social media use. You know, so having a sense of awareness, a mindfulness of what is good, what is useful, what is not good, what is not useful in a social media context, you know, and then getting to the point where those become habits. You know, good habits can be good, like putting on a seatbelt. So habits
brushing your teeth.
Brushing your teeth is less threatening than an addiction. So fostering good social media habits would be a positive thing.
Yeah, and I think doing exactly that and leaning on science to help guide us as we try to construct those habits. Because 10 years ago, we didn't really have a firm foundation for understanding what healthy versus harmful ways of interacting with these spaces were. And we now have some understanding, and I think if you're going to bet on information getting you to where you want to be, like I put my money on science to help us get there. So use what you've learned about in the course to help you optimize the way you use these spaces.
We're gonna need it. We're gonna need a lot of science, because if social media has 1/1000th of the impact that the printing press did, then hold on to your hats.
Yeah, and I would argue that it probably is on a trajectory to have even more impact.
Hold on to your hats.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us and for sharing your expertise and thoughts. And thank you all for tuning in. If you haven't already, please check out and share The Power of Social Media and Effects on Children Teach Out, which is live now on Coursera and FutureLearn. I'll also note that we have over 40 other teach-outs archived on Michigan Online that you can check out as well. Our content is available under a Creative Commons license and can be reused and shared with credit. We hope to see you all join the conversation. Thank you again for engaging in discussion today. Take care.